rope was already around your neck. You could feel the rough hemp digging into your skin, scratching with every shallow breath you managed to take. Your hands were tied behind your back so tightly the rope had cut off circulation. Your fingers were numb. A crowd had gathered in the town square. Hundreds of people, men, women, children, they'd come to watch you die. Some were eating, some were laughing. A few children sat on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. You were 19 years old. Your crime was stealing a loaf of bread. One loaf. You'd taken it from a baker's windowsill because you hadn't eaten in 3 days. You'd been caught within an hour. There was no trial, not really. Just a magistrate who looked at you for 30 seconds, confirmed you had no money for a fine, and sentenced you to hang. That was 4 days ago. Now you stood on the platform, the noose tight around your throat, and you realized that everything you'd been told about justice and fairness had been a lie. This wasn't about right or wrong. This was about power and terror and keeping people like you in line. The early to mid-1700s in colonial America and England saw crime punished with a brutality that's hard to imagine today. The legal system wasn't designed to rehabilitate or reform. It was designed to terrify, to make examples, to demonstrate what happened when you stepped outside the narrow lines drawn by those with power. Punishment was public because fear worked best when everyone could see it. Hangings, whippings, brandings, mutilations, all performed in town squares where entire communities were expected to attend. Missing a public execution could itself raise suspicion. Why weren't you there? What were you trying to hide? The list of crimes punishable by death was staggeringly long. Murder, obviously, but also theft of anything worth more than a shilling. Poaching, forgery, cutting down a tree on someone else's land. Being out at night without good reason. Repeat offenses of almost anything. The law didn't distinguish between desperate poverty and malicious intent. Stealing food to feed your starving children carried the same penalty as armed robbery, and there was no consistency. Two people could commit the same crime and receive wildly different sentences based entirely on who they were, who they knew, or what mood the magistrate happened to be in that day. Justice wasn't blind. It was corrupt, arbitrary, and viciously biased toward protecting the wealthy and punishing the poor. Sarah Wickham was 17 when she was arrested. She worked as a maid in a home outside Boston. The family she worked for was relatively wealthy. The husband was a merchant. The wife spent her days visiting other wealthy women and complaining about servants. Sarah earned barely enough to cover her room at a boarding house and 1 meal a day. She'd been working there for 2 years, sending most of her wages back to her mother in Connecticut. Then one day the wife noticed a silver spoon was missing, just one, from a set of 12. She immediately accused Sarah. Sarah denied it. She'd never stolen anything in her life, but the wife insisted. She had the constable search Sarah's room at the boarding house. They didn't find the spoon. They didn't find anything, but that didn't matter. The accusation had been made. Sarah was arrested anyway. The magistrate hearing her case didn't care about evidence. The wife was a respected woman from a good family. Sarah was a servant with no family connections and no money. The magistrate believed the wife. Sarah was convicted of theft. The sentence was 30 lashes and branding. She was taken to the town square 3 days later. They stripped her to the waist in front of everyone. Then they tied her to a post and whipped her 30 times. The whip was leather with metal tips. It tore her skin open. Blood ran down her back and soaked into her skirt. People watched. Some turned away. Most didn't. After the whipping, they heated an iron brand in a fire until it glowed red. Then they pressed it into her thumb. The letter T for thief. The smell of burning flesh made her vomit. The pain was beyond anything she'd ever imagined. When it was over, they cut her loose and left her lying in the dirt. Sarah couldn't work after that. Her back was infected within days. She had no money for a doctor. The boarding house threw her out because she couldn't pay rent. She tried to go back to her employer, thinking maybe they'd take pity, but the wife slammed the door in her face. Sarah ended up on the streets. Her back never healed properly. The scars were thick and painful. The brand on her thumb marked her forever. No one would hire her. Everyone could see the tea, everyone knew she'd been convicted of theft, even though she'd never actually stolen anything. She begged for a while, but people avoided her. A branded thief was considered morally contaminated, someone whose presence brought shame. After 2 weeks on the streets, Sarah tried to steal food from a market stall. She was caught immediately. This time the sentence was death, second offense. The law was clear. She was hanged in the same town square where she'd been whipped and branded. She was 17 years old. The silver spoon was never found. Years later, the merchant's wife discovered it had fallen behind a cabinet. She never mentioned it to anyone. There was no presumption of innocence. If you were accused, especially by someone with social standing, you were guilty. Trials were brief, sometimes lasting less than 10 minutes. You weren't allowed a lawyer unless you could pay for one, and even then, lawyers could do little against a determined magistrate. Evidence was often irrelevant. Confessions were extracted through torture. They'd use thumbscrews, the rack, or simply beat you until you admitted to whatever they wanted to hear. And once you confessed, that was it. Conviction was guaranteed. The wealthy could sometimes buy their way out. Pay a fine, offer compensation, make a deal. But the poor had nothing to bargain with. Your body was the only thing you owned, so your body was what they took. Whippings left permanent scars. Brandings marked you for life. Time in the pillory meant standing locked in place while crowds threw rocks, rotten food, and human waste at you. People died in the pillory from head injuries. Ears were nailed to the wood. Noses were cut off. And all of this was legal, sanctioned, celebrated as justice being served. If you lived in that time and you were accused of a crime you didn't commit, what could you have done? If you had no money, no connections, no way to prove your innocence, would you have fought the accusation knowing it would make things worse? Or would you have accepted the punishment and hoped you survived it? Execution day was a community event. Businesses closed. Schools let out. Families brought picnic lunches. Vendors sold food and drink. Children ran around playing while adults found good viewing spots. The condemned were brought out in carts, sometimes several at once. Hangings were the most common method. They'd put you on the gallows, tie the noose, and then pull the cart away or open a trapdoor. But these weren't the quick, merciful hangings designed to break your neck instantly. Those came later. In the 1700s, you were simply suspended and left to strangle. It took minutes, sometimes longer. Your body would convulse. You'd lose control of your bladder and bowels. The crowd would watch until you finally stopped moving. Then they'd leave your body hanging for hours, sometimes days, as a warning. In London, executed criminals were sometimes hanged in chains at crossroads, their bodies left to rot as a public reminder of what happened to lawbreakers. Some were dissected by surgeons as part of their sentence. Your body became public property, used for medical study without consent. There was no dignity in death, no respect. You were an example, a prop in the theater of state power. But here's the part that makes everything worse. The crimes that earned death sentences were often crimes of survival. A father executed for poaching a rabbit to feed his children. A woman hanged for stealing cloth to make clothes. A boy killed for taking firewood from a wealthy landowner's forest. Meanwhile, the wealthy committed crimes constantly and faced no consequences. Tax evasion, fraud, abuse of servants, rape. These were common among the upper classes and they were ignored. A wealthy man could beat his servant to death and claim it was discipline. A poor man who stole a chicken to keep his family from starving would hang. The system wasn't about maintaining order or protecting society. It was about protecting wealth and property. Your life was worth less than a loaf of bread if you had no money. And everyone knew it. The cruelty was the point. The inequality was intentional. The law existed to preserve a hierarchy where the rich stayed rich and the poor stayed terrified. Think about the legal protections you have today. The right to a lawyer, the right to a fair trial, the presumption of innocence, due process. Now imagine all of that gone. Imagine being convicted based on nothing but someone's word against yours. Imagine facing death for taking food when you were starving. Would you trust the system? Would you believe in justice? Most people who entered the criminal justice system didn't come out whole. Even if you survived your punishment, you were marked, branded, scarred, or simply known as a criminal. That label followed you forever. You couldn't get work. You couldn't rent a room. You couldn't move to a new town and start over because constables in neighboring areas kept records and shared information. Once you were marked, you were pushed further into crime because crime was the only option left. It was a cycle designed to fail you. Punish someone harshly enough that they can't reintegrate into society, then punish them again when they commit another crime out of desperation. James Ridley went through this cycle. He was convicted of petty theft at 15, branded and whipped. Couldn't find work after that. Stole again out of hunger. Second offense meant hanging, but the magistrate commuted it to transportation. James was shipped to the American colonies as an indentured servant, essentially a slave for 7 years. The voyage across the Atlantic took 2 months. Prisoners were chained in the hold of the ship, packed so tightly you couldn't lie down. The air was thick and foul. Seasickness was constant. People died from disease, dehydration, exhaustion. Their bodies were thrown overboard. James watched men go mad from the conditions, screaming until their voices gave out. When the ship finally reached Virginia, the survivors were sold at auction to plantation owners. James was bought by a tobacco farmer. The work was brutal. 18-hour days in the fields under the sun. Beatings for working too slowly. Starvation rations. He was property for 7 years. He had no rights. If he ran, he'd be hunted down and the time would be added to his sentence. Most transported prisoners didn't survive their full term. Disease, overwork, punishment. James made it 5 years. Then he collapsed in the field one afternoon. Heat exhaustion. The overseer left him there. By the time someone checked, James was dead. He was 20 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the plantation with dozens of others. The system ground through thousands of people like James every year. Convicts transported to colonies. Prisoners executed in public squares. People branded and cast out of society. And the crime rate never went down. Because harsh punishment doesn't prevent crime. It just punishes the desperate and powerless while leaving the root causes untouched. Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity. Those things drove crime, but addressing them would have required systemic change, redistribution of resources, giving up power. So instead, society doubled down on cruelty, made the punishments harsher, made the examples more public, and acted shocked when it didn't work. The people who created and enforced these laws weren't ignorant. They knew the system was unjust. They knew it targeted the poor. They knew innocent people were convicted and killed. But they didn't care, because the system protected them. It kept the lower classes terrified and compliant. It preserved property rights and social hierarchy. The suffering of the poor was an acceptable cost for maintaining their comfort and power. Even after reforms began in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, after some of the harshest punishments were abolished, the fundamental inequality remained. The law still favored the wealthy. Courts still presumed guilt based on class. Prisons replaced public executions, but they were just slower, more hidden forms of the same cruelty. And the belief that criminals were irredeemable, that they deserved whatever happened to them, persisted. It persists still. In every harsh sentencing law, in every prison system designed to punish rather than rehabilitate, in every moment when society sees someone convicted of a crime and decides they've forfeited their humanity. The gallows may be gone, but the impulse that built them remains. The desire to make examples, to terrify others into compliance, to protect property over people. The colonial justice system wasn't an aberration. It was a foundation. And we're still building on it, still operating from the same assumptions, still accepting that some people matter less than others, still believing that cruelty serves justice when all it really serves is power.